Hello.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me, Asif?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Clear, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me, Asif?
Yes, sir.
Okay. There is some problem. Just give me a minute. Just give me a minute. Hello. Asif, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
There is some, I had some problem getting the internet connection. Dr. Arun, can you hear me, Arun?
Yeah, I can hear you and I can see you well as well.
Fine. Okay. Right. Good evening, everyone. Gives me great pleasure to introduce my dearest Arun. He was my classmate during my MBBS days, during our MBBS days, and then we continue to have our post association. He became an Arun has completed his anesthesia training, went on to have his European diploma in intensive care in 2004. And at present, he is working as professor and head of Department of Critical Care Medicine in Savida Dental College and Hospital, Chennai. Previously, he was the professor and head of Critical Care Medicine in Sri Ramachandra University. He has about 70 papers to his credit. Very academically oriented person. During his postgraduate days, I remember his colleagues telling him as walking Miller. Miller is a textbook of anesthesia, the postgraduate book of anesthesia. And he still remains very much attached to his academic activities. Widely traveled, as I understand him. He has his wife who is also and his daughter is very happy to welcome you, my dear Arun, and introducing you to our Malappuram Surgical Society. Over to you, dear Arun, to give a talk on sepsis. And this is a very important topic for postgraduates, because in a surgical quorum, we all discuss surgical topics, but then it's also nice to have knowledge of a very basic topic, which we all come across. We come across sepsis, septic patients. We come across deaths due to sepsis. We come across complications leading rise to sepsis. So it's very important that all the postgraduates listen to Dr. Arun, and there will be plenty of questions which I expect all of you to ask Dr. Arun. Let's not delay. Over to you, dear Arun.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me at the Malappuram Surgical Society, Sajid. Glad to see you. Not met you for a very long time. So I would, Sajid called me a few weeks ago and asked me what I would like to talk to the surgeons. So I asked him what he would want to listen to me, and then he said something that is relevant for everybody. And when I thought about it, the first thing that came to my mind was something on sepsis. And as Sajid said, all of us, whether we are physicians or surgeons or intensivists or pulmonologists, all of us would definitely come across sepsis in our management on a day-to-day basis. In fact, in my practice in the ICU, at least about 60% of the patients that come to the ICU come to us with some form of or some stage of sepsis. So I thought this would be the appropriate topic for us to discuss. And hopefully over the next hour or so, we will share thoughts and learn from each other. So sepsis is not a single disease. Sepsis is a syndrome. When you talk about syndrome, it has three facets. It affects our physiology. It affects our pathology. It affects the biochemistry. And with lots of it, there is a lot of biochemical abnormalities, and all of this is induced by infection. So it is an entire spectrum, and it's a syndrome, not just one disease process. And we know that the incidence of sepsis is increasing worldwide. One of the reasons is that the population of the world is aging, and as people get older, they are more prone for sepsis. And also, it is a very leading cause of mortality all across the globe, including in our country. And when you're talking about mortality, depending upon the stage of sepsis, and mortality can be as high as approximately 50 to 60% in patients with sepsis. So it's a major burden on all of us, major morbidity on our patients. And not only that, not only just mortality, in patients who also survive sepsis, it has been found that at one year post sepsis, even at that time, the mortality remains high. And not only that, their quality of life suffers a lot. So there is a lot of morbidity that is associated with sepsis. Now, for the first time, it was in 1991 that some form of definition of sepsis came to be. Now, this definition revolved around the concept of systemic inflammatory response syndrome. And at that time, the definition was that if a patient had systemic inflammatory response syndrome along with an infection, then that was called as what says at that time was 30 if a patient had tachypnea of more than 22, if the patient had fever of more than 38 degrees centigrade, or hypothermia of less than 36 degrees centigrade, or if the patient had white blood cell count that was more than 12,000, or if it was less than 4,000. If any of these were present, it was considered to be systemic inflammatory response syndrome. Now, if sepsis was associated with organ dysfunction, then that was considered to be severe sepsis. And if severe sepsis was associated with hypotension, then that was classified as septic shock. So this was the initial classification of sepsis way back in 1991. However, there was a big problem with this because sepsis, as you know, is not associated just with infection. It is an inflammatory response to any kind of systemic inflammation, not necessarily just related to infection. It could happen with major trauma. It could happen with a thermal injury, major burns, or it could happen with an inflammatory response like a sterile inflammatory response, like, for example, acute pancreatitis, at least in the initial stages. All of these things can lead on to systemic inflammatory response. So identifying sepsis based on SIRS was a major problem. And it's all, so we have many conditions where SIRS was present even in the absence of sepsis. So it was considered to be too non-specific to be of any utility in the diagnosis and cause of the septic syndrome. And hence, a review of this definition came about a decade later, that was in 2001. And at this point, an attempt was made to codify more signs and symptoms and also incorporate into them other inflammatory laboratory parameters, some predictors, and parameters are the hemodynamic parameters, organ dysfunction parameters, and tissue perfusion parameters. For example, general parameters include, again, like presence and absence of fever. Inflammatory parameters included, again, leukocytosis or C-reactive protein, procalcitonin. Hemodynamic parameters included blood pressure or other organ hemodynamic parameters like central venous oxygen saturation, etc. And then they looked at serum creatinine, LFT, etc., to identify organ dysfunction, and also other tissue perfusion parameters, for example, like serum lactate or capillary filling, etc. So all of that to codify, and by doing this, they thought they could overcome the fallacies of basing the definition of sepsis on CIRS. However, none of these definitions took into consideration factors like why did the patient have sepsis? What were the predisposing factors? What were the actual pathogens that led to sepsis? What were the premorbid conditions of these patients? And most importantly, how did the patient react to this particular infection? What was the host response to this? And these previous definitions also did not look into the presence of organ dysfunction or how bad the organ dysfunctions were. So in 2016, keeping all this into account and multiple further studies that went into the definition of sepsis, another attempt was made to improve upon this definition of sepsis, specifically keeping in mind the host response and pathogen factors of sepsis. And in this definition, it was found that what differentiated sepsis from a plain infection is the way the host responds to the infection. Sepsis is considered as an aberrant or dysregulated host response, and along with the presence of organ dysfunction. So two important new parameters came into the definition of sepsis. That is, sepsis is a dysregulated or enhanced host response to insult, also associated with the presence of organ dysfunction. Organ dysfunction could be renal failure, it could be hepatic failure, it could be cardiac failure, or it could be metabolic acidosis, it could be hypoxia. All of these were considered to be organ failure. Now, what is important here is that sepsis-induced organ failure could be occult. In fact, many times we find that a patient looks septic, but unless we specifically look for the organ dysfunction, we may miss that organ dysfunction. So if a patient comes to you with unexplained organ dysfunction, please always look for the presence of an infection. So it works both ways. In the presence of infection, you could have an occult organ dysfunction, or if a patient presents to you with an organ dysfunction, always look for the presence of an occult infection. It works both ways. It is important that we do this so that we do not miss the diagnosis of sepsis early. Now, keeping all this in mind, the third attempt at definition of sepsis, that is what is called as the Sepsis 3, was made. And this was made by the Society of Critical Care Medicine from America and the European Society of Intensive Care Medicine. Now, how do they go about doing this? They looked at approximately about 1.3 million electronic health records all across the United States and also in Canada. And they analyzed this these records and something which is far more simpler to identify sepsis early in the wards, and also to identify sepsis in a better manner within the intensive care unit. And here they came out with three very simple variables. That is a Glasgow Coma scale of 13 or less, a systolic blood pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury or less, or a respiratory rate that was more than 22 per minute. Now, if two of these three parameters were present, it was considered to be significant enough, and it was a warning that these patients may be in sepsis. Now, this was called as what is called as a QSOFA or quick SOFA. SOFA standing for sequential organ failure assessment. That is the usual scoring system that we do to identify organ systems, but that is more complicated. So because of that, This was an easy way of identifying probability of sepsis at the bedside in the ward. Presence of any of these, two of these three parameters, GCS of 13 or less, systolic blood pressure of 100 millimeters or less, and a respiratory rate of 22 per minute or greater. When they did the statistical analysis, they found that this is what AUROC is called as area under the receiver operator characteristic curve. Now, anything more than about 0.75 is considered to be significant. Here they had a value of about 0.81, and that is considered to be very specific and very sensitive for identification of sepsis in these patients. Now, coming to the SOFA scoring system, as you all know, SOFA scoring system stands for sequential organ failure assessment. It's a scoring system that is commonly used for the diagnosis of organ failure. It looks at all the 6 organ systems: respiration, coagulation, liver, cardiovascular, central nervous system, renal, and renal. You can score it from 0 to 4. So you could have a score that is either 0 or 24. So if you have a SOFA score that is higher than higher SOFA score indicates a higher probability of mortality. So in this definition, sepsis is suspected. Sepsis is called a suspected or documented infection and the presence of acute increase in SOFA score by 2 or more. So if you have a patient in the ICU or in the ward, whether you do a SOFA scoring and you find that the score is 2 or more, and you suspect infection in these patients, or there is documented infection in these patients by way of a positive blood culture or any other sample culture, then this patient has sepsis. It's a far more easier way of identifying sepsis. Now, all the parameters that I showed you for calculation of SOFA, these are parameters that we routinely do in our normal clinical care. There is no specific test that you need to do to identify a SOFA scoring. You can calculate it very easily by the routine tests that we do in our normal clinical care of patients. Now, a SOFA score of more than 2 reflects an overall mortality risk of around 10%. So even if patients have a modest or very mild dysfunction of organs, these are patients who can deteriorate very rapidly, and we need to intervene for these patients very promptly and immediately. Now, coming to septic shock, if a patient with sepsis has persistent hypotension in spite of adequate fluid resuscitation, and if their mean arterial blood pressure is less than 65, and you need to add on vasopressors to maintain a MAP of more than 65, and if these patients also have a serum lactate that is more than 2 millimoles per liter in spite of adequate volume resuscitation, in that case, these patients are called thought to be in septic shock. So if you need vasopressors to maintain your mean arterial pressure more than 65, along with a presence of serum lactate that is more than 2 millimoles per liter, in spite of adequate initial volume resuscitation, then these patients are classified as to be in septic shock. Now, if a patient is classified to be in septic, their mortality is far higher, more than 40%. So we need to identify these patients early, resuscitate these patients early, and treat these patients early. Like in trauma, there is a golden hour in these patients. So we need to identify these patients within an hour and treat these patients within that hour, intervene within that hour to reduce mortality. So that is why time is important. So how can we go ahead with a bedside diagnosis of sepsis? If you suspect infection, do a quick SOFA. That is, look at SOFA, look at the GCS. If the GCS, look for a Glasgow Cosma scale that is 13 or less, look for a respiratory rate of 22 or more, look for a systolic blood pressure of 100 or less. If any two of these is there, then go ahead, then you look for the presence or absence of organ dysfunction. Go and score a full SOFA scoring. Look at all the 6 parameters I just showed you. Now, if your SOFA score is more than 2, then these patients are in sepsis. Now look at the hemodynamic parameters. Does the patient have a mean arterial pressure of 65? in spite of fluid resuscitation. If you need to start vasopressors in spite of fluid resuscitation, and if these patients have a serum lactate level of more than 2 moles per liter, then these patients are in septic shock. So it's easy way of identifying and classifying patients in sepsis or septic shock. Now you'll say, how do we look at serum lactate level? The easiest way to have a serum lactate level is to incorporate that parameter into the arterial blood gas measurement. Now almost all the ABG machines come with lactate as a parameter in the ABG. So every time that you take a blood gas and you want to look for acidosis, you can see the lactate measurement value in that. So that's an easy way of measuring serum lactate. Now coming to the management of sepsis. Now, as you all know, the Surviving Sepsis campaign have called for implementation of bundled care of sepsis. Now, what is a bundled care of sepsis? What do you mean by a bundle? Now, bundle is a series of interventions that is related to each other and related to the management of the disease. Now, if you implement these care processes, different care processes together, then you achieve a better outcome than when you implement these care processes in a piecemeal manner separately. So let's say you have 5 interventions that you want to do. If you do those 5 interventions together, it is better than implementing those 5 interventions separately in a piecemeal manner. Now that is what is called as a bundled care. Now bundled care is the way forward in many of the disease processes in the intensive care unit. For example, prevention of ventilator-associated pneumonia, prevention of catheter-related bloodstream infections, management of sepsis. So there are bundled care for weaning a patient. So bundled care for prevention of delirium in patients in ICU. So bundled care is a way forward in many of the disease modalities in intensive care units. Similarly, also for sepsis. In fact, sepsis was one of the disease parameters where it was initiated, bundled care was initiated. Now, Surviving Sepsis campaign way back in 2001 came out with the bundled care of sepsis. Now, there has been a change in bundled care between 2016 and 18. Over the years from 2001, when sepsis bundle came into being, and because of the campaign of the Surviving Sepsis campaign, sepsis bundles was considered standard of care across the Western world, especially in the United States. And over a period of time, many of the insurance companies came out with mandates that if you have a patient with sepsis, you need to have taken care of those patients using the Surviving Sepsis campaign bundles. If you don't take care of these patients with the SSC and if these patients had a serum lactate that was more than 4 millimoles per liter, then you administered 30 ml per kg of crystalloids. Now, all these four interventions had to be done within 3 hours of a patient coming to the hospital. Subsequently, if after these 4 interventions and if after your initial fluid resuscitation, patient continued to be hypotensive, then if the mean arterial pressure was still less than 65 millimeters of mercury, then you had to start vasopressors. Now, this had to be done within 6 hours of hospital admission. Then once you did this, look how the patient's tissue perfusion is. How do you measure tissue perfusion? Most commonly, it is easily done by measuring serum lactate. So re-measure the serum lactate, see how your serum lactate is, how the serum lactate is trending. It is falling, is it stable, or is it increasing? And then you keep on going over your further fluid resuscitation, vasopressors, and other interventions. So this was the initial sepsis care bundle in 2016. But when they looked at how patients performed with the sepsis, this 3-hour and 6-hour sepsis care bundle, now this was looked at in more than 50,000 patients. This was in New York State because of the mandate of using sepsis care bundle. They had a huge number of patients on whom sepsis care bundle was implemented. More than 85 to 86% of patients with sepsis to hospitals in the United States had implementation of the 3-hour and 6-hour bundle. Now, with this in the background, they went back and retrospectively looked at the charts of more than 50,000 patients in whom these bundles were implemented. The longer it took to implement the 3-hour sepsis bundle, the higher the mortality of these patients were. Now, what the x-axis is the time duration of the 3-hour bundle. And what you have in the hospital, what you in the sepsis 3-hour bundle is completed within 1 hour, their mortality was around 22 to 23%. If it took 2 hours, that increased. If it took 3 hours, that was nearer to 25% than about 23%. Likewise, if it took about 10 hours to complete that, the mortality was far higher, nearly 10% higher. So what did this tell? This said that time was very important. The earlier you achieved your bundle, the earlier you resuscitated these patients, the earlier you gave antibiotics, patients did far better. Now, keeping this in mind, in 2018, the Surviving Sepsis campaign combined the two bundles into one single bundle, and that was called as the 1-hour bundle. So you had to achieve all these targets within 1 hour of patient coming to a hospital. Not within 1 hour of patient reaching the ward, not within 1 hour of patient coming to the ICU, but within 1 hour of patient coming to the casualty. That is the point of the time start ticking when the patient reaches the hospital. That is the emergency room. So you need to measure serum lactate and remeasure serum lactate if it was more than 2 millimoles per liter. Obtain blood cultures prior to administration of antibiotics. Administer broad spectrum antibiotics. Begin rapid administration of fluids, 30 ml per kg of crystalloids for if the patient has hypotension or if their serum lactate was more than 2 millimoles per liter. And if in spite of the initial fluid resuscitation, their mean arterial pressure was less than 65, then start vasopressors. Vasopressors to a target of a mean arterial pressure of 65 millimeters of mercury. So you 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You had five parameters that you need to implement within one patient coming to the emergency room. Now, why are we talking so much about serum lactate? Now, we know that tissue hypoperfusion is universal in patients with sepsis. When you're talking about tissue hypoperfusion, we say that sepsis is a syndrome where there is hyperdynamic circulation. So if you feel for a pulse, the pulse is bounding. So if the pulse is bounding, how is it that the patient has tissue hypoperfusion? You would expect it to be high. That is because of the pathophysiology of sepsis. There are microthrombi that happens. So, and there is also vasoconstriction that happens. Because of all of this, the amount of perfusion deep down into the tissues is not appropriate. And because of tissue hypoperfusion, there is anaerobic metabolism that is happening. And in the presence of anaerobic metabolism, there is hyperlactatemia. In addition, sepsis is a stress factor. And because of the stress, there is increased glycolysis. And when there is increased glycolysis, from our biochemistry classes, we know that there is increased pyruvate production, and the excess pyruvate is unable to be handled by the Krebs cycle, and this excess pyruvate gets converted into lactate. And because of these two factors, there is hyperlactatemia, and this hyperlactatemia is almost universal in sepsis. So if a patient comes to you with hyperlactatemia, or if a patient, in spite of resuscitation, the increased lactate does not decrease, then it means that these patients could have a higher mortality. In other words, a high lactate could also help us in identifying patients with occult tissue hypoperfusion. So if you do an ABG in a patient, let's say who comes to you with some amount of tachycardia, a little bit of decreased urine output, you do an ABG and you find their serum lactate in the ABG, say 3 millimoles per liter, 4 millimoles per liter. Be sure that there is occult tissue hypoperfusion. Resuscitate these patients, give them more volume, give them more fluids, and see redo an ABG, say after about 1 hour or 2 hours, and see how the serum lactate value either decreases or stays same or increases. So that is a way that you could use serum lactate to identifying occult tissue hypoperfusion and your resuscitation. There is a lot of controversy in using lactate as a marker of resuscitation, but I will not go into that. But it is one way by which you could see if you need to resuscitate this patient. It's certainly one way by which you could see if these patients have occult tissue hypoperfusion. Now, coming to blood cultures, we need to take blood cultures as early as possible, and we need to take it before broad spectrum antibiotics are given. Nearly 30 to 50% of patients with severe sepsis or septic shock have a positive blood culture. And if you do get a positive blood culture, it's easier for us to give an appropriate antibiotic to these patients. So why prior to antibiotic administration? Even in the best of centers, even in the best of labs, the amount of time blood culture turns positive is only about 40% or maximum 50%. In rest of the 50% of patients with sepsis, the blood cultures remain negative, even urine cultures, any of the other, even a respiratory sample. So you don't need a positive blood culture to identify sepsis. In about 50% of the patients, you do not get a positive blood culture, even in the best of centers. So in such kind of a scenario, if you give antibiotics and then you take a blood culture, the yield of the cultures is even less. So you'll think, okay, this patient does not have any sepsis, he has not grown anything, and you may not treat it properly, or you find it difficult to give an appropriate antibiotic. So it is important that you take a culture sample before you give antibiotics. Now, when I'm talking about blood cultures, it is important that you take an appropriate amount of blood for culture. So what is an appropriate amount of blood for culture? At least 20 to 30 ml of blood. That is the amount of blood that you need to send to the lab for a culture. If you send a lower amount of blood for culture, then the chances of the lab being able to identify the organism is even less. So you need to send an adequate amount of blood to the lab for a culture, which is around 20 to 30 ml. So if you are unable to take 30 ml in one bottle, send 2 blood culture bottles, maybe around 15 ml in 2 different blood culture bottles. If you have a central line, then you need to take 2 samples of blood, what is called as a paired blood culture. What do you mean by a paired blood culture? You take 2 samples of blood at the same time, one from the central line and one from the peripheral site. Prick the patient on a peripheral site and send samples, 2 blood samples at the same time. Now, why 2 blood samples at the same time? Now, if the lab is able to tell you which sample of blood grew faster, and let's say the central line sample grew faster, about 1 hour faster than the blood culture from the peripheral site, then the likelihood of this being a central line sepsis is very high, and you need to remove the line. Or the lab may be able to culture it, do a quantitative culture, or do a plate method and tell you how many colony counts are there in the central line blood sample, how many colony counts are there in the peripheral line sample. Now, if the colony counts in the central line sample are far more than the peripheral line, then that means it is a central line sepsis. So, but however, do not delay antibiotic for the sake of taking culture. So it would be a good idea to have culture bottles within the patient care area, so that you don't have to wait for it to come from the lab. That way you can ease out the time that is taken to take the blood cultures and initiate your antibiotic treatment. Now, coming to the antimicrobial therapy in sepsis, it is very important that you do not delay antimicrobial therapy in these patients. The more you delay antimicrobial therapy, the higher the mortality. So also it is important that you give an appropriate antibiotic, that is an adequate cover of antibiotic early, because an inadequate antimicrobial therapy is also associated with a higher mortality. Now, this study looked at the appropriateness and the time to antibiotics and mortality. This was a single center study, it was a retrospective study done in about 250 patients. And you have on the y-axis the number of deaths, and on the x-axis you have the time taken to the initial antibiotics. Now you find that The mortality in patients who got antibiotics in 1 hour was in patients with sepsis was about 25%. While if you took about 2 hours to give antibiotics, the mortality increased by nearly 12%, 37%. And this kept on increasing. If you took 4 hours to give you antibiotics, the mortality was nearly 50%. Rapid increase in delay in giving antibiotics. So it's extremely important. Initial antibiotics, initial appropriate antibiotics are given within 1 hour of patient coming to the hospital. That is within 1 hour of patient coming to the emergency room or the casualty. What about appropriateness of antibiotics? The same study. This is again a study that was done in 2009 that looked at appropriateness of antibiotics when they compared the empirical choice of antibiotic and compared it with the cultures that grew. Now they find that if the patient had got an initial empirical appropriate antibiotic, the mortality was far lower than if these patients got appropriate antibiotic. Now this was true whether the cultures were positive or culture negative. It's true with patients who had bacteremia or who did not have bacteremia, whether the infection was community acquired or nosocomial. Across all kinds of infections, if the patients got appropriate empiric antibiotic, then the mortality was far lower. So this again points to the importance of obtaining cultures early, obtaining cultures before antibiotics so that we can get an indication of what the infection is. What about de-escalation? What do you mean by de-escalation of antibiotic? When we are starting broad spectrum antibiotic initially, and we get a culture within about 48 or 72 hours after 72 hours of starting antibiotics, and let's say we have Pseudomonas grown on the wound or Pseudomonas grown in the blood, and we have initiated a patient on meropenem because we thought that would cover. And when the culture comes, the Pseudomonas is sensitive to, let's say, cephalosporin sulbactam or piperacillin tazobactam or any of the other lower end antibiotics. We need to stop meropenem and go on to a lower spectrum antibiotic. That is what is called as de-escalation. Now, this study looked at de-escalation after cultures, the initial broad spectrum empiric antibiotic. What do they find? They find whether you continue the initial broad spectrum antibiotic or you de-escalated to a more narrow spectrum antibiotic within 24 hours, mortality was same. So if the mortality by reducing your antibiotic, the mortality did not increase. So then why continue with an expensive broad spectrum antibiotic that you started initially? It is better that you de-escalate this antibiotic as soon as you get your culture reports in your hand. That is within about 48 to 72 hours. Now, so antibiotics in a nutshell, start broad spectrum empiric antibiotic within 1 hour of patient coming to the emergency room. It is a more targeted, narrow specific antibiotic as soon as the cultures are available. And it has been found that short course of antibiotic is as effective as a longer course of antibiotic. There are many trials that have shown that a 5 to 7 day course of antibiotics is as effective as 10 to 14 days of antibiotics. So you do not need to give a long-term antibiotic, except probably for some very specific, for example, MRSA infections in the blood. In those kind of cases, you would probably want to give a longer duration of antibiotic. Otherwise, a short course of antibiotic is considered to be as effective as a longer course of antibiotic. Now, you probably need to give a longer course of antibiotics in certain conditions where it is very difficult to control the source of infection or difficult to reach site. In these kind of, for example, I can think of as osteomyelitis. Any infections is a difficult to reach area for treatment. In these conditions, you probably need to have a longer duration of antibiotic. You could use procalcitonin to decide on de-escalation. Procalcitonin, like C-reactive protein, is one of the that is generally high in patients with sepsis and any inflammation. So you may not be able to use it as a way of diagnosing sepsis. But if a patient has a high procalcitonin, you're treating with antibiotics, and over a period of time, let's say you repeat the procalcitonin and you find the initial procalcitonin is decreased or it has become normal, it means that your antibiotics has worked. You can de-escalate your antibiotics to a more narrow spectrum antibiotic. So you could probably use procalcitonin for de-escalation. Now, is combination therapy required to extend coverage? In certain situations where you're not very sure about what the organism is, in those kind of situation, probably a combination therapy with 2 antibiotics would be better. Otherwise, routinely combination therapy is not required. Studies have not shown any major benefit with combination therapy. Coming to fluids in sepsis, what are the fluids that you use? There have been multiple trials that has looked at various fluids for resuscitation. People have looked at albumin. People have looked at synthetic colloids like hydroxyethyl starch, hemaxil. They've looked at normal saline. They've looked at ringer lactate. Multiple fluids have been looked at, but what are concerns with regard to fluid? Patients with sepsis early, and the amount of fluid that you give is 30 ml per kg of body weight of crystalloids. When I'm talking about crystalloids, the ideal crystalloids is the balanced crystalloid. That means a ringer lactate or a plasmolite. Plasmolite is more expensive, but ringer lactate is easily available. It is cheap. It can be used, or you could use normal saline. But a balanced solution like ringer lactate is preferable over normal saline, because in large volume resuscitation, a normal saline is associated with hypochloremic acidosis, and that can possibly lead on to higher incidence of renal failure or even higher mortality. So currently, the trend is to use ringer lactate as resuscitation fluid. There is absolutely no role for any colloids in resuscitation of patients. So you do not use hemaxil, you do not use hydroxyethyl starch, none of these. There is no role for colloids, no role for albumin for resuscitation of patients with sepsis. Can you use albumin when large volume resuscitation is used? Again, trials have really not shown any benefit with use of albumin. Even when it is used, the 20% albumin that we have is not what's being used. What is being used is 4% albumin or 5% albumin. That's what's being used for resuscitation. But again, trials have shown that it is of no use. Using crystalloids is equivalent to using albumin. So then why would you go ahead and use something far more expensive? In fact, in certain kind of situation, for example, in patients with traumatic brain injury, use of albumin has been associated with mortality. So obviously, if a patient has traumatic brain injury, you wouldn't want to use albumin. So the way forward is crystalloids, and balanced crystalloids are the best way forward. There is no really any role for any use of colloids. So how much fluids, after your initial fluids, how do you calculate how much fluid is used? And for that, you need to look at what is called as fluid responsiveness or fluid tolerance. What is fluid responsiveness? If I give fluid to a patient, does this administration of fluid results in increase in cardiac output, result in increase in tissue perfusion? That is what is called as fluid responsiveness. If you have a patient who is not fluid responsive, then there is no point in giving more fluid. Not only that, you need to look at if the patient will take more fluid. That is what is called as fluid tolerance. Now, what is the best way of doing this currently? It is by point of care ultrasounds in the ICU. Anybody, it doesn't need to be intensivist, it doesn't need to be anesthetist. Have an ultrasound machine, it's easily done. We don't need to be a radiologist, we don't need to be a cardiologist to do point of care ultrasound. When I'm talking about a point of care ultrasound, I'm not talking about a full-fledged examination of the heart, a full-fledged examination of the abdomen. We are talking about eyeballing. Now, for example, this is an echo. Now, evaluate the left function. This is eyeballing. Now, if the video here is contracting very well, while here the left ventricle here is not contracting very well. Now, in this patient, I will not give more fluid. In this patient, I will not give more fluid. This patient will tolerate more fluid. Now, if you look at here, Look at this patient here in next slide. The left ventricle is contracting very vigorously. Both the walls are touching together, which means that this patient will take in a lot of fluid. The volume is so low that when the heart is contracting, both the walls of the ventricles are touching together. So in the first scenario here, you would want to give more volume. Here you would not want to give any further volume. But in this scenario, in the last scenario, this patient will take in a lot of volume because this patient is very hypovolemic. Now it's very easily found. You don't need to be a cardiologist to identify this. Now coming to right ventricle, assess the right ventricle. Look at the right ventricle here. This is the left ventricle, this is the right ventricle. It's totally dilated. Totally dilated, the septum is pushed to the left side. This patient has right ventricular failure. Here, this patient has a lot of fluid in the system. He will not take more volume. This patient will not tolerate more volume. Here you don't want to give more volume in these patients. Look at the lung. Now here you do a lung ultrasound. Now this is a normal lung that looks that is normal lung ultrasound. You don't find any shadows here. It is very normal. What you find here is a pleura. And you look at these rockets that comes down. Only one or two of they're called as B lines. Only about 2 to maximum 3. This is a normal lung. Now in patients who fluid overloaded, you will have more than 3 of those rockets. There are multiple rockets here. See, more than 3 in one window. Here, this is moderate fluid overload. And if there's severe fluid overload, it's all white in color. The lung is all white in color. This patient has pulmonary edema. You won't want to give fluids in these patients. So point of care ultrasounds is an easy way of identifying how much of volume. If here, another way of doing it is looking at the inferior vena cava in the inferior vena cava. This touch each other, walls are touching each other with respiration. Look at this inferior vena cava. It is totally dilated. It does not collapse with respiration, normal respiration. So this is a patient who will take in more volume, while this is a patient who will not take in more volume. So these are ways by which you can use point of care ultrasound in the critical care unit or in the ward or in the emergency to identify how much fluids can you give these patients. So after initial stabilization, what you want is you don't want to overload these patients. You want a restricted fluid strategy. It's been found that if the patient has a positive patients into a negative fluid for balance. So maybe give a little bit of Lasix, give a little bit of furosemide, and get these patients on negative balance. Because the longer these patients stay on balance, the higher their mortality. And this can be done by looking at dynamic parameters like point of care ultrasound, looking at IVC collapsibility, lung ultrasound, etc. And one of the ways by which you can achieve a restricted fluid balance is by using early vasopressors. So you are given 500 ml of fluid or 1 liter of fluid initially. In spite of that, the blood pressure is low in these patients. Don't give better way of achieving mean arterial pressure than overloading patients with more amount of fluid. So early vasopressors is one of the way into getting into what is called as a restrictive fluid strategy. So less is more. That is the dictum. That is the paradigm. Don't give a lot of fluids after the initial fluid resuscitation. Measure fluid responsiveness, measure fluid tolerance, and titrate your fluids accordingly. If the patients continue to be hypotensive, start vasopressors early. And a serial examination is required. So you do your IVC measurement now. You give some volume. After some time, half an hour, 45 minutes later, redo the IVC. Look at the IVC, look at the lung again. If IVC is not collapsing anymore, stop giving fluids. That is way. So repeated management, repeated serial examinations using point of care ultrasound is what is important. And it's been found that use of point of care ultrasounds decreases the eventual use of intravenous fluid. it increases the vasopressors used, and ultimately it decreases mortality. So it's important that we learn how to use how to use ultrasound in a very easy manner. It is very easily learned. We don't need radiologists. We don't need to be cardiologists to do this. Very easily learned. Coming to vasopressors, norepinephrine is the first choice of vasopressor in septic shock. And when you're using norepinephrine, use it early. Don't use it late. As I said, after the initial fluid resuscitation of 30 ml per kg, if the patient is still hypotensing, start using norepinephrine. Early use of norepinephrine is also associated with increased stroke volume, and it's also associated with increased cardiac output, thereby improving microcirculation, thereby increasing tissue perfusion, and you can have a decreased serum lactate level. What about adrenaline? Maybe you don't have adrenaline also can be used. However, use of adrenaline can be associated with tachycardia. It can also be associated with initial metabolic abnormalities because adrenaline increases glycolysis. Lactic acidosis can increase. Tachycardia can worsen. So if noradrenaline is there, you could also use adrenaline, but I prefer to use noradrenaline. Or in spite of not arterial pressure target, that is 65 millimeters of mercury, you can add on adrenaline as a second drug. So yes, you can use adrenaline. What about renal dose of dopamine? It has been found that low doses of dopamine, that is 2 to 3 micrograms per kg per minute of dopamine in critically ill patients, increases urine output. So is this useful? It has been found that the number of patients that the urine output increases is very variable. You cannot predict it. Neither does this have any effect on renal replacement therapy or time to renal recovery. So multiple studies have looked into it, and it has been found that the so-called renal dose of dopamine is of no use. So there is no role for that 2 to 3 mics per kg per minute of dopamine that we all have learned to use as in our PG days or in our early practice. It is no more used. What about dopamine as a vasopressor? Is it good? Studies have shown that use of dopamine is associated with higher incidence of arrhythmia, and this higher incidence of arrhythmia is associated with higher incidence of mortality. So currently, routine use of dopamine in septic shock, or for that matter, any shock, is not encouraged because the dopamine is associated with higher incidence of mortality. So noradrenaline is the first choice of drug. If noradrenaline is not available, you could use epinephrine or adrenaline. And if in spite of noradrenaline, still the patient continues to be hypotensive, you could use adrenaline as a second agent. What about vasopressin? Now, vasopressin, again, is a very good agent to be used as a second agent, not as a first agent in treatment of shock, because we all are aware that there is something called as a relative adrenal insufficiency in patients with shock, in septic shock. So there is a relative adrenal insufficiency, there is a decrease in vasopressin. So vasopressin is a good second agent to be used in treatment of septic shock. However, high doses of vasopressin is associated with skin necrosis and splanchnic ischemia. So you use what is called as a low dose vasopressin, that is 0.03 units per minute. So for us Indians, about 1 to 2 units of vasopressin per hour will be an appropriate dose. 1 to 2 units of vasopressin per hour. So if in spite of adrenaline, noradrenaline, it's used also as a second agent. What about dobutamine? Do you need to use dobutamine? In many patients, even after optimizing the amount of fluids that you give, even after optimizing the preload of these patients, and you find that they have poor tissue hypoperfusion. In such kind of patients, you could possibly use dobutamine, but there is no role for routine use of dobutamine in all patients with sepsis. In the presence of poor tissue perfusion or tissue hypoperfusion, in spite of vasopressors, in spite of achieving mean arterial pressure, in spite of fluid resuscitation, in such kind of patients, you could use dobutamine, but no role in there. So in a nutshell, the choice of vasopressors, use vasopressors early. This enables restrictive fluid strategy. Target vasopressors to achieve a mean arterial pressure of 65 millimeters of mercury. Noradrenaline is the drug of septic shock. Use noradrenaline early, and early use of noradrenaline is associated with lower mortality. Vasopressin is a good second agent. You could use it early. So don't wait for a high dose of noradrenaline with moderate doses of noradrenaline. What is that moderate dose? Around 0.2 to 0.3 micrograms of noradrenaline per kg per minute. If that is more, if that you reach that noradrenaline dose and still you have not achieved a mean arterial pressure of 65, then add on vasopressin. Add this on early. Routine use of dopamine is associated with higher mortality. Do not use it. Routine use of dobutamine is not required. You also need to look at the other issues. If a patient is on mechanical ventilation, you need to do what is called as a lung protective strategy. What is that? 6 ml per kg of tidal volume, 6 ml per kg ideal body weight of tidal volume, and maintaining a plateau pressure, that is airway pressure on the ventilator of less than 30 centimeters of water. If the patient is in ARDS, prone these patients. Early nutrition, early enteral nutrition is very, very important. And it is the way forward rather than parenteral nutrition. Parenteral nutrition is associated with higher mortality, higher incidence of sepsis. So you don't want parenteral nutrition as a routine. You want to use early enteral nutrition. What is early enteral nutrition? Within 24 to 48 hours of patient coming to the hospital. Within 24 to 48 hours of patient in the ICU. That is early enteral nutrition. You may not need to give the entire caloric count as enteral nutrition. Even what is called as a trophic nutrition, that is around 20 to 30 ml every hour, given that itself would be enough. Glycemic control, maintain a blood sugar of within about 150 to 180 milligrams %. So measure capillary blood glucose, and if the blood glucose is above 180 milligrams %, irrespective of their diabetic status, start these patients on insulin. The best way to do insulin is to give an insulin infusion, because that is easily targeted. If you cannot give an infusion, give a subcutaneous dose of short-acting insulin, but always maintain a glycemic control. A glycemic control that is not maintained, especially in surgical settings, is associated with higher mortality. What about steroids? Do you need to use steroids in these patients? If there is persistent hypotension in spite of fluids, in spite of vasopressors, then you could give what is called as a stress doses of hydrocortisone. That is not more than 200 milligrams of hydrocortisone every 24 hours. What I do is I give it 50 milligrams of hydrocortisone every 6th hourly, or you could also give this 200 milligrams as an infusion over a period of 24 hours. But only in patients where there is persistent hypotension, in spite of fluid resuscitation, in spite of vasopressors. You don't routinely use steroids. Most of these patients are, if they are on ventilators, if they are on anticoagulants, etc., there are high risk for GI bleed. So you need to give stress ulcer prophylaxis, PP inhibitor, proton pump inhibitors, or H2 blockers may be used in these patients, has to be used in these patients, in those who are high risk of GI bleeding. What about blood transfusion? In patients with sepsis, in patients in critical care unit, we go for what is called as a lower threshold for transfusion, which means that anybody who has a hemoglobin level of 7 grams % is considered normal. You don't need to transfuse this patient. You don't want a hemoglobin that is 10, 11, or 12. You only want a hemoglobin that is 7 grams %. I'm not talking about elderly patients. I'm not talking about patients who have ischemic heart disease. All these are exceptions. But in all other patients, we only need to maintain a hemoglobin in the range of about 7 grams %. Transfusion is known to be associated with higher incidence of mortality, higher incidence of renal failure, higher incidence of infections. So we don't want transfusion in critically ill unit. We want patients only with a hemoglobin of about 7 that is found to be normal. Any patient with sepsis is high risk for thrombosis. So they need to be on anticoagulants. The best anticoagulant is a low molecular heparin, not unfractionated heparin. Unfractionated heparin may be given in patients where you're thinking in terms of a recent intervention. For example, yes, this patient needs to go for a laparotomy recently. over the next 24 hours. So in those cases, you could use unfractionated heparin instead of low molecular heparin. Otherwise, by all means, a low molecular heparin is far more better than unfractionated heparin. Unfractionated heparin is also associated with thrombocytopenia, especially in these patients, what is called as heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. So low molecular weight heparin is preferred over unfractionated heparin. So take-home message, sepsis is defined as life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by a dysregulated host response to infection. And septic shock is a subset of these patients in whom the underlying circulatory and cellular metabolic abnormalities is profound and is substantially increases mortality. QSOFA or QSOFA by measuring, looking at the GCS score, looking at the respiratory rate, and looking at the blood pressure. That is a GCS of 13 or less, a respiratory rate of 22 or more, or a systolic blood pressure of 100 or less. If you have any two of these patients probably has sepsis, and go ahead and do a full-fledged SOFA scoring. And if you have a SOFA scoring that is more than 2 and you suspect infection, these patients are considered to be in sepsis. And like in trauma, in sepsis also there is what is called as a golden hour. Catch these patients in this 1 hour and go ahead with the 1 hour bundle. Do fluid resuscitate, give them appropriate antibiotic, give them vasopressors, all in this 1 hour. Measure serum lactate, repeat them, see how the tissue hypoperfusion is, give appropriate antibiotics. All of them, please do it within 1 hour. And when I'm saying 1 hour, I'm talking about 1 hour from the time of point of contact with us. That is the casualty, not the ward, not the ICU. It's very important so all this is done within the emergency room or the casualty. Time is life. So sepsis also have a golden hour. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Arun.
I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are.
No words to yes. So I welcome suggestions, questions. Please do ask questions and suggestions.
Any peace in the crowd?
Yes. There are many. We will make them ask questions.
Dr. Shenoy here.
Yes, sir. Please say.
Sir?
Yeah. Do you have any preference before starting a blood culture of any particular antibiotic, depending upon your thinking whether patient is having a respiratory sepsis or patient is having a GI sepsis or patient is having a orthosepsis? Okay, sir.
Now choice of an empiric antibiotic. Now, as I said, we need to go for a broad spectrum antibiotic. Now, what is an ideal broad spectrum antibiotic? Now, the best way to choose that antibiotics is by knowing the resistance pattern and organism that is grown in your own organization. So it is important that each of us can identify that. So if the microbiology department from each of our hospitals is able to tell us, okay, the most common respiratory pathogen in our hospital is, let's say, Pseudomonas. Then we know what is the appropriate antibiotic we can use. Or the most common organism that we grow in the blood in our hospital is Acinetobacter or E. coli. Then we know what is the organism that can be used. So the best way to do this is to know your own antibiogram, what is called as antibiogram. That is, what is the most common organisms that is grown and what is the sensitivity pattern of that organism in your organization. Now, why I say this is, it can vary from unit to unit. It can vary from hospital to hospital. Now, if we look at India and if we look at the West, the most common organisms in the blood that is grown in the West is gram-positive organisms. It is Staph aureus. While in India, the most common organisms that is grown in the blood is gram-negative organisms. So what we use is different from what the Western world uses. Similarly, even within our own country, individual units will have different organisms. But generally, from what we have found is, if it is a respiratory sample, if it is a patient who is coming from the community, it would be a community acquired pneumonia. The chances of it being a multi-drug resistant organism is not much. In such kind of a situation, let's say somebody comes to us with a community acquired pneumonia. If we start them on a third generation cephalosporin, for example, ceftriaxone, that is probably enough. But if the pneumonia was something that was developed within the hospital, say on a patient who's on a ventilator, the chance of it being a multi-drug resistant organism, like for example, multi-drug resistant Klebsiella or multi-drug resistant E. coli or Acinetobacter is far higher. So in that case, ceftriaxone may not work. You probably would want to go for a carbapenem like a meropenem or imipenem, or maybe even polymyxin. Now, will a carbapenem work or will a polymyxin work? That you will know depending upon what is the sensitivity pattern of the organism in the organization that you work. In my center, the chances of Acinetobacter being sensitive to piperacillin tazobactam or cephalosporin sulbactam is very, very, very low. So if I have a patient who has a hospital-acquired pneumonia or a hospital-acquired bacteremia, in that case, I would say, okay, this is very likely to be Acinetobacter. This is very likely to be a multi-drug resistant E. coli. I'm going to use probably directly a carbapenem. Very likely it is going to be sensitive to either imipenem or meropenem, not piperacillin tazobactam or cephalosporin sulbactam. Similarly, how sick the patient is. So if you have a patient who is coming to you with septic shock, now you would want to use the broadest spectrum antibiotic possible. I would use a carbapenem straight away. If somebody is coming with septic shock, I would use either imipenem or meropenem straight away, not a lower end antibiotic. But if this patient is more stable, he's not in septic shock, he's probably in sepsis, but maybe a little bit of tachycardia, no hypotension, I give fluids, hypotension has settled, I would probably go for either a piperacillin tazobactam or a cephalosporin sulbactam or something like that. Or I know, if I know this patient has a central line. Now, if this patient has central line, or if this patient has an endocarditis, a high chance of it being a gram-positive infection, then I'll probably start this patient on a gram-positive cover, like for example, either vancomycin or teicoplanin or linezolid or something like that. So it also will depend upon the site of infection. A urinary tract infection is far more likely to be a gram-negative infection than a gram-positive infection. A patient who has a catheter and who doesn't have a catheter, a patient who has a catheter probably far more likely to have a multi-drug resistant organism than somebody who does not have a catheter. So it depends upon the place you work, it depends upon the site of infection, it depends upon the number of days a patient has been in hospital, depends upon the whether the patient has lines, catheters, etc. But generally speaking, gram-negative sepsis is far more common in India than gram-positive sepsis. In gram-negative sepsis, the most common organisms that we come across are Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, multi-drug-resistant Klebsiella, or multi-drug-resistant E. coli. And most commonly in India, again, either a combination of piperacillin tazobactam or cephalosporin sulbactam, or a combination of or a carbapenem like imipenem or meropenem, or in really multi-drug resistant organism, polymyxin. That would be the ideal empiric choice of antibiotic. I'm talking about empiric choice. That is, we don't have a culture report. The patient has come to us and we are choosing this antibiotic now. Now, once the culture comes back, we can target therapy according to the culture. I hope I have answered it.
Thank you, Dr. Arun Kumar. You have very nicely explained. And entire sepsis, you have covered in such a nice, simple way. Always people, they have that sepsis means something big and very dreadful thing. But you have made it so simple, so concise. I think even now my PGs will handle the sepsis with confidence after this lecture.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Any other questions?
So one thing which we all understood is that the threshold for identifying sepsis should be very low. In other words, you should have a high suspicion of a patient going in for sepsis.
Very, very true. Very true.
Yeah. So,
So
that's
as I said, the quick SOFA is a very easy way of identifying it in the ward. Look at somebody who is a little drowsy, very commonly elderly patients coming like that. Somebody who has a little tachypneic, somebody who is a little bit hypotensing. Have your horns up. Think about sepsis. Think about sepsis. Go ahead and do a SOFA scoring. It's an easy way. All of us would have LFT done. All of us would have creatinine done, urea done. We know whether what is the BP of the patient. If we have done a ABG, we know what is the PO2 of this patient, how much oxygen that we are giving. We can easily measure what is the Glasgow Coma scale. All of this are very easily done. So very easily we can, if we put up a chart of the SOFA scoring in the wards or in the ICU, it just takes less than 2 minutes to calculate the SOFA scoring. So if you have a SOFA score that is more than 2, it means that there is organ dysfunction. And if you're suspecting infection in these patients have sepsis. Treat them accordingly.
Another interesting thing is that as surgeons, we tend to go in for surgeries probably without a proper, even source of sepsis outside our area of interest. That also tackled, learned the hard way. When we think that the surgery goes on smoothly, and then you see that the patient develops the sepsis, probably we have forgotten about the patient having a chest infection. We have forgotten about the patient having a urinary tract infection. So simultaneously, if the patient has a source of infection, I think it is a very for into doing surgeries, especially elective surgeries. What is your opinion, Dr. Arun?
Very true. So now how do I go about doing that is, I have a very low threshold for sending in cultures. If I have any suspicion, I have a patient who is with me and I see the total count is going up. The patient has a couple of spikes of fever. It doesn't need to be 200, 102, 103 and all. About 101, couple of spikes, the culture going up. Tachycardia is a very, very sensitive indicator of something going wrong. So if you have a patient who is tachycardic, who is a little hypotensing, who have little amount of fever, think about sepsis. Don't worry about sending cultures. Send the cultures early. Send the cultures early. Send appropriate amount of culture. If you have a catheter who's been there for a long period of time, send the urine culture. Send the urine routine. Look at the amount of pus cells that is present in the urine. If you're taking a blood culture, please send 2 samples of blood culture, not just 1 sample of blood culture. Take 2 samples of blood culture, prick 2 different sites, take about 20 ml to 30 ml of blood culture, send it. Follow up it with the lab. If you have a central line, ensure that you take blood from the central line and from the peripheral site simultaneously. 2 different bottles sent. Ask the lab to analyze it and tell you what is what. So don't hesitate to send cultures early. Send them quickly. That would be a way of identifying these patients early. And always in patients who's been in hospital, think of other sources of sepsis, not just the surgical source of sepsis. A respiratory infection, a urinary tract infection is very, very common. A pyelonephritis that was not there earlier developing in these patients is very common. Think about all of that. Acalculous cholecystitis is a very, very common cause of sepsis in surgical patients, in ICU. Think about it. Probably all that you need to do is put in a drain and drain the bile from that. There may not be any stones, but it's a very common source of sepsis in these patients.
Any other questions, please?
May I ask a question, sir?
Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Good evening. My name is Dr. Salman. I'm from Department of Anesthesia, assistant professor. A very nice talk, sir. Very lucid and very smooth, sir. I just wanted to know, like, what is the utility of C-reactive protein in terms of detection of especially the occult sepsis that you mentioned.
Okay.
And it's two more things. It's prognostication, and the third point will be like for de-escalation of antibiotics.
Okay. Now C-reactive protein is another inflammatory marker like procalcitonin. Now, is it useful to identify sepsis? Is it useful to diagnose sepsis? May not be, because I'll give you an example. A patient comes to you with trauma, polytrauma. If you do a C-reactive protein, the C-reactive protein would be high because it's inflammation. If you have a patient who has necrotizing, who has acute pancreatitis, who is not infective, it is not a septic acute pancreatitis, just acute pancreatitis. If you do C-reactive protein, the C-reactive protein will be high because it is just an inflammatory marker. So using C-reactive protein to diagnose sepsis may not be a right way, but you could use C-reactive protein as a negative marker. Now, if you have a C-reactive protein that is normal, the chances of sepsis is very remote. Similarly, procalcitonin. If you have a procalcitonin that is normal, the chance of patient having sepsis is very remote. But if you have a procalcitonin that is high, it need not necessarily mean the patient has sepsis. It could be any of the other inflammatory conditions. So you could use it as a negative predictor, not as a positive predictor.
Okay, sir. Yeah, in terms of de-escalation of antibiotics?
Yeah, in terms of de-escalation of antibiotics, the studies have looked at procalcitonin, not as C-reactive protein. Now, a procalcitonin can be, if a procalcitonin that is trending normal, initial procalcitonin that is high, and that is then trending normal. You started antibiotics on day 4 or day 5, you redo the procalcitonin, you find the procalcitonin to be normal now. In that case, you could probably even stop the antibiotic or de-escalate the antibiotic to a more narrow spectrum. That can be used, not again for diagnosis of sepsis. Again, it's coming to C-reactive protein for de-escalation. Well, maybe you could, but studies have looked more at procalcitonin than C-reactive protein.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Dr. Arun, there is a question from Professor Sunil S. from Kottayam.
Please, sir, please go ahead.
He has asked how long can central lines remain in the vein? Do we send routine blood cultures after 5 days or so?
No, you don't. Central lines can remain as long as you need it. Now, one of the key of preventing central line infection is every single day, ask yourself the question, does this patient need a central line? If this patient does not need a central line, remove that line immediately. The easiest way of preventing central line related infection is removing a line at the earliest possible time. So every day, have a checklist. Every single day, ask the question yourself, does this patient need a central line? Doesn't need it, you remove the line. Now, if a line is in place, do you have to send cultures every 5 days? No, you do not have to send cultures every 5 days. In fact, it is discouraged to send cultures every 5 days or routinely, because many times what you find is you grow commensal cells and then you start treating the commensal cells. So you don't want to send cultures routinely unless and otherwise you suspect infection. If you suspect infection, only then take a culture and send it. Do not routinely send a culture, because the likelihood of you growing something that is a commensal is very, very high, and you end up treating something that does not need to be treated. I hope I've answered that. Any other questions?
Good evening, sir. I am postgraduate from MES, sir, Arjun.
Okay.
Sir, what about the pre-op optimization of hemoglobin level, sir? Pre-op, if you are planning for surgery.
Okay. If you're planning for surgery, now again, even the current, if you look at the ASA guidelines, American Society of Anesthesiology guidelines on pre-op optimization and pre-op hemoglobin in these patients, even in such scenarios, if you are talking about surgeries that are not having a lot of blood loss, if you're talking about patients who are not very elderly, who does not have any active bleeding, who does not have any ischemic heart disease, even in these cases, you do not need to have a hemoglobin of about 10. Even in these patients, about 7 to 8 grams of hemoglobin is adequate. That is what the current ASA guidelines say.
Thank you, sir.
Professor Sunil has one more doubt, Arun.
Please go ahead.
Yes. He has asked if, so he just want a confirmation regarding CRP versus procalcitonin to exclude sepsis.
Okay.
So he just wanted to know which is a better one.
I would think procalcitonin is a better one, because that is which is studied more, and that is what the evidence is more. So so again, I would like to mention that procalcitonin not for confirming presence of sepsis, procalcitonin for excluding sepsis. A negative procalcitonin excludes sepsis. A positive procalcitonin does not rule in sepsis. I hope I am clear about that.
Any other questions? Postgraduates? Surgery postgraduates? Anesthesia postgraduates?
My parting shot would be to have a high suspicion of sepsis in patients and intervene early. Time is of very importance. When we talk about treatment, all of us think about, okay, when the patient comes to the ICU, when the patient comes to the ward. But in most of our settings, by the time that happens, time has already elapsed. So if you're seeing your patients in the emergency room, in the casualty, initiate treatment at that point in time. That would be key.
Thank you so much.
And also in if your hospitals, when you're talking to your administrators, please insist that they incorporate serum lactate parameter in the arterial blood gas values. It's a very easy way of identifying what the serum lactate is. It is not very expensive. Routinely, most of the ABG machines may not come with it, but insist on having that parameter within the ABG values.
Sir, may I ask one more question, sir?
Please go ahead.
Sir, in surgical setting, when we take up a lot of intestinal obstruction cases, and most of them will be having peritonitis and on the brim of sepsis. So in post-operative period, so how do you suggest the feeding, sir, enteral feeding? Because we want the gut to be free for some time.
Okay.
So yeah, please.
Okay, it's I think a very good question, and where surgeons are always worried about starting feeds. But if you actually look at the ERAS protocol, for early recovery, enhanced recovery from surgery, the ERAS protocol talk about early feeding of patients, even patients with bowel surgeries, extensive bowel surgeries. And when they're talking about early feeding, they're talking about feeding within about 12 hours post-surgery. Now, when we're talking about feeding, we're not talking about a complete full-fledged 2 liters per day or 1.5 liters per day. It could even be a tropic feed. When you're talking about tropic feed, we're talking about 20 to 30 ml per hour feeds. That will be like less than 500 ml of fluid that goes into the gut. Now, what is the rationale for that? Even tropic feeds is considered to maintain the mucosal integrity of the bowel and prevent endotoxemia, prevent patients going into sepsis by keeping the mucosa intact in the bowel. Now, does it cause gastric distension? Does it cause bowel dehiscence? I don't think so. Now, the way to look at it is, what is the normal amount of fluid that is secreted by the stomach? It is approximately about 2 to 3 liters. What is the normal amount of fluid secreted by the bowel? It's in the range of about 4 to 5 liters per day. If we are going to add on another 500 or 600 ml to this, is it going to cause a bowel dehiscence? Is it going to cause a gastric distension? Unlikely. But monitor for it. Now, when we are going to feed these patients, you're not going to give a bolus feed to these patients. You give what is called as a gravity feeds, which means that, let's say you prepare about 500 ml of nutrition fluid, nutrition preparation, put them into a saline bottle or a feeding bottle, run it slowly as a drip method over a period of 24 hours, 10 ml per hour, 20 ml per hour. It will continuously keep going. Don't give a bolus of 50 ml, 100 ml, put it into a syringe and give it. Not that way. As a continuous infusion, give it as a drip over 24-hour period. Most of the patient is highly unlikely the patient will not tolerate it. It is extremely rare that I have had to stop feeds because of abdominal distension or diarrhea or vomiting in postoperative patients. But I know that there is a reluctance and the worry from the surgeon's side about bowel dehiscence because of early feeding. But studies have shown the other way, that patients on whom feeds have started early do better.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
If we can wind up the session, a wonderful day spent with you, Arun.
Thank you so much.
Great evening.
Thank you so much.
Everybody has enjoyed a lot of great feedbacks, positive feedbacks, great replies.
Thank you so much.
So
Thank
I
you very
think,
much, Sajid.
We must part with you sadly, but I request Dr. Asif to wind up the session. Dr. Asif?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Arun sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Asif.
And also there was some very active participation from Dr. Shanai, who was head of the department in MES, and also Salman sir, and also a lot of comments coming in, especially from Rajan sir, Sunil sir, Siddhik sir, and I think everyone, most of them have asked for a YouTube link and also for a recording of this class as well. So we'll be sharing with them then. Thank you very much, sir, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I humbly request all other members of Malappuram Surgical Club to please stay back while the others sleep.
So I will leave now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.